right, hello everybody, and welcome back to Cookie Pocket, episode 95, and apparently my microphone is still amusing.
It's still funny.
Yes, I am using a shotgun microphone for this show. Hey, it's what I had at the beginning of the season, and I plugged it in, so no reason to unplug it now. Today, we are going to be talking about... Actually, wait a minute, before I get to the film, how can I forget? We have a guest.
How could you forget?
How could you forget?
Our first and
disgusting
most recurring guest at this point. Sir, would you care to introduce yourself to our audience?
Well, for those Cookie Pocket listeners who have been ride or dies since the show's second season, you will know me from Ivan's Childhood and Uncut Gems. What I don't want to sound too presumptuous here, but I would say are the two greatest episodes of the Cookie Pocket thus far produced. My name is Nick Hawdon, filmmaker extraordinaire, and college friend of the one Zach Garrigus.
Two important taglines.
Yes.
Yes, indeed. And Nick has come on the podcast today to help us discuss a great cinematic classic. Possibly one of the biggest names we've talked about on the show, because we're talking about Taxi Driver today.
Yes.
Directed by Martin Scorsese. At this point, I think the story of Taxi Driver, or at least the characters, are pretty well known. But essentially, the film is about a man named Travis Bickle, who is a Vietnam War veteran living in New York City, and he has trouble sleeping. So he gets a job with a taxi service. And the film essentially starts as him riding around New York City and the things that he encounters and his opinions on those things and the way that the world is going as America moves into the 1970s and the world beyond. And he gets into a bit of a fracas based on those experiences. And that's kind of all I'll say for it right now. We'll get into more plot details later on. But as always, let's just start with general thoughts. What did you guys think of Taxi Driver?
If you would let me go first.
Yes, please. Go.
Taxi Driver is, of all the films I've talked about on here, and really, why even limit it to those three? Of all the films I have ever seen, this is maybe my favorite ever. If you asked me to name 4 or 5 films that I thought were perfect, this would be one of them. This is absolutely my favorite film of the 1970s. It's my favorite Scorsese work. I think it is perfectly executed. And it is so singular and unique that everything that has come after it has made it seem significantly less so by way of riffing on it. Mm-hmm. It seems like the entirety of film has been in conversation with Taxi Driver since it came out. I think its reputation precedes it. It is hypnotic. It's jazzy, smooth, gritty. It's dreamlike. It's nightmarish. It has Travis Bickle, one of the greatest protagonists ever, in what I would say is Paul Schrader's greatest writing achievement. Sort of the template he would use for every film he wrote afterward.
Yeah, pretty
much. Sort of lonely weirdo with a diary. Yeah, I just think there are not a lot of things that are false here. It is perfectly executed, perfectly shot, edited, acted. The music is amazing. I could gush, honestly, for an entire hour without taking a breath about how much I love it, so I will yield the floor.
Okay, that's a great starting point, I think.
Yeah. Well, I revisited this film as well. This was my second time watching it. I think I watched it of my own volition maybe a year or so ago, after doing this podcast and having an English class that was centered around some film, and really just like the beginning of my college years kind of opening up cinema to me. And I would also credit that Letterboxd, the app, to that to a strange extent, just because
Thank you, app.
it does kind of
point
me in the right direction some of the time. And this time, I gave it a 5 the first time, and I gave it a 5 this time. I think it's awesome. And at the same time, I don't really know how to summarize that or how to like constructively identify why. But it's just such an experience. It's so it just holds your attention the whole way through, and I don't think of Travis Bickle as a super dynamic character. I don't know if that's controversial to say given the shootout at the end, but and I don't know how much has changed from like the beginning of the film to the end. I think all that happens in between sort of resolves itself to some extent, without giving too much away. And I tend to usually crusade against repetitive themes. It's an awesome theme here, one of the best. But I tend to dislike when a film reuses the same main theme like a dozen times. And The Neutral Love does that, and it kind of gets on my nerves. But here it does not bother me at all. We literally have like the one saxophone piece and then the one like kind of it's basically the same song. It's more like a B section with a speeding up drum beat or whatever. And I just never get
Shout out
tired of it.
Bernard Herrmann.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's stellar stuff. And the supporting actors really make it too. I hope we'll talk about Palantine, however you pronounce it, to some extent, because I think that's a really key character. Yeah, the interactions are so spot on. I don't have anything bad to say about it, except at the MPAA for threatening Scorsese with NC-17 before he like made the shootout like more sepia or whatever the heck he did to get around.
Jody will turn out fine. I don't think there's any problem. We already know. Yeah. The thing that surprised me the most was that it wasn't really like an impactful or like there wasn't anything about it that was very like provoking besides thought provoking, if that makes sense. Like even the last scene wasn't really like of surprise. It was kind of just like you're listening along in the dream state the entire time and just taking in all the different colors and the jazz and the and whatever face or saying De Niro has at that time. Aphorism, I guess, is the word. I think it's really, it separates each scene less as like, it feels like a linear track. It doesn't feel like there's like one thing happening after another. It kind of just feels like everything's all happening and you're just kind of like an endless state of constant like bustling, but none of the bustling really matters. So you're basically just subservient to however Travis is seeing everything, and you're kind of just following his occupation, which is why the movie's called. So yeah, so
be this much taxi driving in the film.
Yeah, really, literally. So yeah, I think that's what makes it the most effective for me, and I think a lot of the themes, I think Nick touched on this already, but like there's so many films that have tapped into the same themes and not only just like directly copying some of these scenes, like exactly. Yeah. Well, I'm sure we'll get into that, but yes. But not only that, but like just the anti-establishment, like, oh, this one individual that's going crazy might have a point kind of thing. But I think there's so many contexts and like subliminal messaging going on here that I feel like that's really like, for me, it stands out immediately. So yeah, I really enjoyed it, but it wasn't like a fun time. It was just like I've never done drugs, and this is what this is. So
Okay, well, this was also a rewatch for me, and 5 out of 5. I think that Taxi Driver's a perfect film. Like Nick, it's also my favorite Scorsese, right up there next to Silence in the runner-up position. This was one that I watched in freshman year of college when it was on Netflix, and my family when I was growing up was very strict about MPAA ratings. So kind of my senior year of high school going into college was kind of the period of time where I caught up on all the big boy movies. And for so long, I had kind of just sort of heard about Taxi Driver as like that's a very adult movie. There's a lot of violence in that, and I'd seen the only thing I think I'd seen of Taxi Driver was the single shot at the end after the shootout where De Niro raises his finger to his head and mimes a gun and shooting himself, and he's soaked in blood in that, and he's got this mohawk, and I was like, what could this movie be about as like a younger high schooler? So going into it in my freshman year of college, I was expecting an utter violent bloodbath. I was expecting, I don't know, like Peter Jackson's Brain Dead or something. Something really scandalizing, kind of like Mitchell mentioned, only to find that I think for the most part, the movie really isn't all that scandalous. I think it has heavy things to say and pointed adult things to say. But even when it's being violent, I don't think it feels gratuitous. Everything feels kind of necessary and like it's serving the plot and serving the characters. One of my biggest complaints, I think, with 70s cinema when I was younger is that it all has this very kind of scrappy, on-the-street feel, which is deliberate. But I'm someone who enjoys a lot of 80s stuff with a much kind of slicker, stylized feel a lot more. So 70s stuff to me when I was younger felt almost a little dry, a little dull, and I would get bored of it kind of quickly. But even at that point, Taxi Driver to me, I was into it. And I think a lot of that I give credit to Robert De Niro for, because the movie totally rests on his shoulders, I think, and he's such a fascinating character where you hear him say these things and write these things in his diary, and some of them are just totally insane, but you can tell they make sense to him, and he carries out that conviction, and he's convincing with that. Others, you have no idea what that means to him or why he's saying it. It's a lot of the script for this was based on the diaries of Arthur Bremer, I think, who shot George Wallace like 10 minutes from where I live in the early 70s. And so I think the movie is trying to kind of tap into that feeling as well, of like, these are the writings of somebody who's totally dropped off the map. And some of it makes sense, and some of it really doesn't. And that might mean something, or it might mean nothing at all. Who's to say? And it's kind of like looking into the void and trying to interpret a meaning there. And I find that really fascinating and sort of endlessly rewatchable. But Christian, you mentioned Palantine, so I kind of want to go back and touch on that. This is a film that, at least for me, I think has kind of two very distinct halves. There's kind of the whole plot line of Travis meeting Sybil Shepherd and eventually trying to assassinate the senator or the candidate. And then there's the whole half with Sport and Jodie Foster and his quote-unquote rescuing this child prostitute. So my question is, how do you guys feel those two halves inform each other? And what do you feel they lend each other in the ultimate meaning that the film is going for?
Yeah, I have to say, I find Palantine very compelling, just because I think it's comparison, obviously. I mean, the comparison of, at the beginning of the film, Travis Bickle is still above the surface, you might say. He finds, he seems to see himself as above the fray. He has all these lines about, the rain washing away all the scum from the street, He's just doing this for a job because he can't sleep. He's not part of what makes New York terrible. Mm-hmm. He sort of aspires to be a normal person. It's just that he seems to be just incapable of being normal. Mm-hmm. And I think sort of the loftiness of politics, especially, it's interesting sort of post-Watergate how politics took a pretty serious hit, and politicians in general. But there is sort of the facade of respectability that comes with politics. And the fact that Sybil Shepherd is working in politics, and she seems to be somebody who knows what she believes and who is competent and, of course, stunningly beautiful. Mm-hmm. It's something that Travis Bickle aspires to. And I think when he is incapable of making it work with her, he becomes part of the underground. It's sort of an above and below contrast between these two halves of the film. And, obviously he reacts pretty violently to realizing that he might be part of the underbelly of New York.
Mm-hmm.
And so he does almost, I won't spoil too much, but he does almost sort of strike back against that respectability that he seems to have been rejected from in the first half.
Mm-hmm.
So it's dichotomy, it's comparison.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think the most interesting difference between Bickle and the other characters in the film is that we see like noticeable shifts in the way the supporting characters interact with every different person, whereas I feel like Bickle is mostly himself with everybody. And most of the time this manifests as conversational awkwardness or him overstepping a little bit, which is taken many steps further in The King of Comedy when Robert De Niro plays another character. But like when Palatine's in his cap and he starts talking to Palatine, and there's this like Palatine's talking in a hushed voice to, I don't know if it's his campaign advisor or someone, and there's like this shift where speaking in hushed tone, noticing that the cab driver is talking to him, mixture of annoyance and surprise on his face that this guy even cares or to engage with him, and then like the tactful politician just sort of like manifesting in a split second, and this sort of like faux sincerity, but very like verbally skilled and knowing what questions to ask, and I just love that exchange in general, and I think it's fascinating that when he asks Travis to what his most important issue is in politics, first he says he doesn't follow politics at all, which is true but hilarious given that he's the one instigating this whole conversation and saying, I'm so excited to vote for you and I hope you win. And two, then he basically rants about the filth in New York, and I think in maybe less literal terms he's referring to like homelessness and the drug problems and violence and just this large basket of issues that is probably to some extent unsolvable, certainly in Palatine's eyes. And I think the most interesting thing is that before Palatine hears him say this, my take on it is that Palatine viewed Bickle as fitting, at least having more in common with that than he did with him. And I just think so much is communicated in a relatively simple exchange, which is played between like fairly standard archetypes of politician that makes campaign promises that he won't keep, and hopeful civilian that doesn't follow politics closely but wants good things to happen. And that's just one of many exchanges. I think on romantic lines you get similarly emotionally resonant exchanges with Sybil Shepherd, and yeah, it's just sometimes the best thing you can do is simplicity executed perfectly.
Mm-hmm. And I think Zach saying that De Niro's carrying this is like an understatement. I mean, he literally he defines the way other characters are acting. Like every character, even when they're not interacting with him, is somehow expecting a reaction out of him. Like even when Palatine is like speaking, because he's a part of the audience technically, we're expecting his reaction. Like, how is he going to react to this situation, or how is he going to react to these people in the back of his cab? Like, everything entirely revolves around him because we're seeing everything from his perspective. So seeing it as somebody who's essentially, like, by implication and by action is just establishing himself outside of the establishment, and him being like outside of the whole thing, because we all live in a society, right? So he is defining, like, eventually he just puts everything into all one basket, like every bad egg in the basket, and like that was a Great Escape reference, all in one place. And he's basically saying that regardless of if you're a part of the problem, you are the problem. Like, there's no negotiating it, and that's what I think Christian mentioning the simplicity, that's really what it comes down to. But just seeing how he reacts and how he plays it out, not only like from an acting perspective, but just as like a complete third party, a real third party candidate. So, yeah.
Yeah. No, it is an interesting sort of, Travis Bickle throughout the course of the film is broadening the parameters of what he defines as bad and what needs to change. He, at some point in the film, lumps himself within those parameters until he gets to the only thing that could possibly be good in the world, which is a 12-year-old girl who has now been corrupted by the world. And I feel like that is definitely sort of a turning point for him. But it's like, yeah, it's an interesting descent into a sort of nihilistic insanity spiral that we see in Travis Bickle. And that's, I mean, De Niro, oh my God. Like, this is, Robert De Niro is probably one of the actors I've watched the most of anybody. I know who he is. I know what he looks like. I know how he talks, right? He's very iconic. But I still, when I watch this film, I don't see Robert De Niro. It's incredible. I'm like, that's Travis Bickle. That's not Robert De Niro. And I feel like there is a common gripe with him, which is that he doesn't have a lot of range, that he's very good at playing a specific archetype of character. I want anybody who thinks that to watch this, because it is the most unique and interesting character I think I've ever seen. And every single second he is on camera, he is fully embodying Travis Bickle. It's a true tour de force, if I've ever seen one.
Yeah, I was really surprised when kind of rereading up on this film for this episode to read or recognize, I guess, for the first time, that he shot this after The Godfather Part 2, which is... It's so bizarre to me, because in The Godfather Part 2, he feels like a very mature character. He has this aura of authority around him. And in this, he embodies like the scrappy, out of work, I will take any pay, just out of college type guy so well. And I think he really throws himself into it physically as well. Not just in terms of like, the weight that he lost for the film, but there's scenes in this where he looks like a melting candle. The scene where he's talking to Peter Boyle, I got a lot of bad ideas in my head scene. He's like sweaty and his hair is like pasted across his forehead and he has huge bags, and it's just such a turnaround to later in the film where he's gained this sort of surety about himself, but at the same time looks maybe even more insane than he did earlier, and even more frightening. I think this time that I watched it, I kind of addressed it or tried to read it a lot more as Travis not really having any kind of a grand plan, and some of that is also my kind of reading into what inspired the script. And thinking, okay, Arthur Bremer, but also that kind of takes me to a few years after this film came out, and somebody who really comes to mind watching this film is Mark David Chapman. And if you kind of read up on sort of his plan or what he did in the days surrounding his shooting John Lennon, he really didn't have one. He just kind of showed up, and he didn't necessarily even have anything against John Lennon. He said it was about the bigger than Jesus comment, but later he contradicted that. And you get the impression that he kind of just wanted to do something that seemed important and impactful. And that's kind of the reading that I get from Travis in this film. I don't necessarily... I think it's an important note that the film never really states what kind of a candidate Palantine is. He doesn't seem like that great of a guy, but all of his like sort of political speeches are very kind of generic, us against them. He could be a very conservative candidate. He could be a very liberal candidate. All he really represents, I think, is power, which is really populism, which I think is really emphasized in the scene right before Travis is kind of walking up to shoot him. There's this statue behind Palantine with his fists raised, and while he's speaking, he keeps raising his fists to kind of match that statue and that kind of authority. And I think that's just taking out that authority is something that Travis thinks will make him important and impactful, and that's not necessarily even a good thing, but it's a memorable thing. And if you read Mark David Chapman's comments on, well, what if you had not killed John Lennon, or something had gotten in the way and you hadn't been able to get to him? And his comments are kind of just like, well, I think I would have gone out and killed somebody else at some point. And it appears that it didn't necessarily even matter that it was John Lennon. And so I think the whole last half of this film isn't necessarily even like a huge rescue attempt or anything like that. He just goes, well, plan A didn't work. I guess there's this other thing I could do. And he ends up in the massacre at the end. I think this time around it all felt kind of accidental and eventual to me. Whether that was intentional or not, I guess this reading was very kind of first person from Travis's perspective for me. But speaking of Travis's perspective, I also want to talk about the ending, because there has been a lot's been made of the ending of this movie. Some people think it didn't happen. Some people think that it's in his head. Some people think he's still in a coma. There's lots of different perspectives on how much of the ending is real, or if any of it is. So I'm just kind of curious, what are your thoughts on the ending? And if you think any of it is sort of fictional or purely from Travis' perspective, how much of it do you think is that way?
Yeah, I mean, the idea of Travis being an unreliable narrator is not super out of left field, right? Mm-hmm. He's not clearly not in the best shape mentally, and if we are seeing this film through his eyes, which I feel like there's a lot of evidence that we are, there's a question of how much of this at all happened. Mm-hmm. I'm a big proponent of, if it's not immediately apparent whether something is real or fake, maybe that's kind of the point. Mm-hmm. Is it something to be figured out, or is it meant to be ambiguous? And I think the ambiguity of the ending works really well. The odds in a city of 8 million people that he keeps running into Sybil Shepherd in her, she gets in his taxi in the end. Is it wish fulfillment? Does he want to not have to need her? I think they're interesting questions.
Yeah.
Yeah. I never considered that it was not just real. Of the possibilities you've presented, Zach, I think that the most plausible might be that he's still in the coma, but I always just assumed that it was happening. And I think I kind of like it best if it is happening, because it's the closest we get to seeing him grow as a character, because I think if that scene were to happen like 50 minutes ago, in terms of the runtime, or even 30, he would like chase after her and try to make something more of it. And I think the art of it is that he just kind of lets her go. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, this also doesn't really strike me as a dishonest film. I feel like it is very genuine and very truthful. I think the reason it works is because Bickle buys into everything, so you buy into everything as the viewer. It feels like a weird curveball to throw right at the end that this didn't happen, mm-hmm. for a film that is so sort of honest about itself, I would say.
Mm-hmm. If Bickle's an unreliable narrator, he's not portraying his own experiences unreliably.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Unless the whole movie is not real.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, Betsy going into the cab is probably one of the least believable things. I think it doesn't make any sense, like, contextually. I mean, it doesn't make any sense, like, I guess, I don't know. I think I understand where Christian's coming from, that it makes a lot more sense to just accept the whole thing as reality, but, and I do see what you're saying, Nick, about it, like, the whole movie's basically presenting as, like, an honest, like, portrayal and a perspective of society, especially at that time. But I also think that there is like a kernel of benefit, like, seeing it as if he's still in his coma, or seeing as if there's an ideal being reached, I guess. Especially with Iris, like, that whole letter was basically the perfect situation that he was idealizing about and was telling her. That it just works out perfectly, and that her family, like, she was trashing her family earlier, but, like, now everything's fine because he did this one thing. So, like Nick had mentioned about him making an impact, like, that's really what it comes down to, whether or not you want to accept that he actually did make an impact, or are things just going to go status quo again. But I think the status quo thing, mentioning it now, is interesting because he is going back to his normal job. He has his normal hair. He's doing the normal thing again. And then there's, like, the rearview mirror scene at the very end. So I think it really can go both ways. I'll just go with Roger Ebert and say it doesn't matter.
Okay. Yeah.
So
Yeah, I certainly don't think. I think anytime that somebody encounters something interpretive or impressionistic in a film and goes, "Ooh, I gotta crack it," like it's a Rubik's Cube, that's, like, the wrong way to approach it. I think if something feels interpretive, the point is that there are different ways that you can read into it, and that's okay. To me, I think the aspect of the ending that feels most likely to be something that Travis has insisted happened, even though it probably didn't, and the only one that I'm convinced, okay, this might be a fiction, is the conversation in the rearview mirror. Because that, to me, really feels like, oh, this is what I wish I could say to her. And it sort of feels almost like, Nick, you mentioned wish fulfillment. And episodes and episodes ago, I don't know what film we were talking about, but we were discussing a film, and I mentioned the like, incel fantasy of the most beautiful girl in the world is going to try to talk to me, and I'm going to turn her down. And that's kind of what that ending rearview mirror conversation feels like. Where in reality, perhaps she got in the cab and they just kind of rode silently for a while, and then she got out and vaguely tried a hi or how are ya, and then he drove off. In his head, he's sort of imagining this situation where he comes out on top and kind of regains the moral high ground somehow. I do think if he's still in the coma, or if the letter didn't happen, things like that I think actively take away from the film. But I think that conversation being a fiction complements it in a certain way to me. And I do think there's evidence, like deliberate evidence, left in the ending that the preceding events did actually happen. Like Travis still has the scar on his neck from being shot in the neck. So there is, like, physical evidence there that actually did happen. And I don't think they give an exact amount of time since the massacre took place. So it's believable that he would have had to, that he's gone through all of the legal red tape or whatever that was involved in actually getting back out onto the street since that happened. But yeah, the mirror to me stands out as a potential fiction. But everything else, I'm keen to say, yes, it did happen. That's the actual plot. And I feel like it kind of takes away from it to say that those are fictions. I'm going to pull out a citation now. In his book, Cinema Speculation, Quentin Tarantino, everyone's favorite authority on classic film. This is a book that Christian gave me, actually. Thank you, Christian.
Yay!
Quentin Tarantino, he does this on every film that he mentions in that book, but he kind of takes this tough stance on Taxi Driver, where he says that when you get down to brass tacks, Taxi Driver is just like any other 70s grindhouse violent revenge film, like, say, a Death Wish, except it's kind of found an audience that lends it greater meaning over time since its release. Do you guys think there's any truth to that? Can you kind of understand that reading, or do you think Quentin's just talking a load of baloney?
As an avid fan of the film Death Wish, I think it is very easy to see why this is much more popular than Death Wish, because it is not a film that tries to have an agenda, unlike Death Wish, which is incredibly dated and has very firm beliefs, despite how hilariously incorrect they might be. Taxi Driver is a film that is also about vigilante violence and about the lack of authority and the lack of law and order in 1970s New York. but it's a film that is entirely subjective, rather than, something like Dirty Harry.
Oh yeah.
Or films like that have sort of an end in mind, with what their characters have a clear arc, have a clear mission. Travis Bickle is a much more fleshed out real character in that he doesn't really know what he's doing. He doesn't have an agenda beyond just sort of an unplaceable angst towards the world. Maybe it's PTSD, maybe he's born that way. He seems to have a very strained relationship with his parents, from what we can glimpse. I think that's the important thing that sets Taxi Driver apart from any other sort of 70s grindhouse vigilante justice film, in that it doesn't believe in anywhere near the lofty ideals that any of the other ones do. It doesn't seem to have really a real answer on whether vigilante violence will accomplish anything. Mm-hmm. It's a film that acknowledges that the police are not there to help you, that the president is not there to help you, but it doesn't really seem to believe that you can help yourself either. And I think that's the main thing that makes it more relatable.
Okay.
I don't know. I guess I accept Tarantino's comments, but I think I have more of an issue with what some people would take away from that than what it is he's saying exactly, because, and we've gotten into the weeds of subjective versus objective on this podcast before, but I think it's at least notable that everybody is different and has different preferences and favorite films or whatever, and I'm sure there is no perfect film out there. Even the perfect films like Taxi Driver and others that we've given 5s to or whatever, there is no film out there where everybody gives it a 5 or where nobody gives it a 1. There's always exceptions to that rule. So all we can really notice are trends of majority and reaction. And I think Tarantino saying that it has a fan base that has over time granted it more importance or whatever, I think that's endured, and I think we are living proof of that. Because we weren't alive in the 70s, and we get something out of this. And I think like a shared human reaction to something is even without like specific justification in and of itself like a critically valuable thing and an indicator of a quality of a film's ability to communicate what it wants to communicate and connect with an audience. So the same way that Star Wars is like, sorry Zach, I had to bring in Star Wars. The same way that Star Wars is like a beat by beat Joseph Campbell hero's journey thing, but so many people have latched onto it in like 50 years. That's significant, and maybe we don't have the exact vocabulary or from a film production standpoint we can't pinpoint why it's like we can, but at some level the human experience is its own category and own way of evaluating something.
Okay. All right.
Mm-hmm.
Pretty big brain. Pretty big.
I'm trying.
The brains on this guy, yeah.
Yeah.
Subjective versus objective.
Yeah. I think objectively Christian's exploded my brain. I don't know. I think Joker is pretty superior film here.
Okay.
Yeah,
I don't hate
Joaquin Phoenix. Nobody can beat him. Hey, and we had Joaquin Phoenix and De Niro in that movie. So if you do the math there,
that's right.
You might as well.
Talent plus talent.
Yes. Yeah, I think. I think in this case it's a lot more of a thought-provoking film that's intended to make you develop your own opinions about society and about how the director was trying to portray these sequence of events through the lens of De Niro's character, and I think that's pretty much it. I don't think I think you can objectively quantify every little thing that happens in Avengers Infinity War and you'll still no one will disagree with you unless they're rabid fans, which I don't even know if they are around anymore, but maybe they are. Christian can let me know. He's probably got it in somewhere where there's somebody that's still supporting the MCU. But yeah, I think any cult following this film has gotten thus far, I think it's deserved.
Yeah.
I think that's pretty unquestionable based on what I know.
No, it's absolutely earned. And I mean, it's a film that asks questions, which is, I think, a lot braver than a film that tries to answer questions.
Right.
You might say it's cowardly for a film to not actively, full-throatedly believe in anything. But I think what Taxi Driver does is turn the mirror on you. What do you believe? What do you represent? Whatever you put onto this character comes from you. Whatever you get out of Taxi Driver, you get from your own experiences. I think it's very hard to do with a film, to create such an iconic character who is very unique, very recognizable, very memorable, but also make him a blank slate that a viewer can project whatever they want onto. And I think that's where a lot of Taxi Driver facsimiles fail. They give their main character a goal. They give their main character an agenda, a set of beliefs beyond sort of what is immediately convenient to believe. Not going to name names, but you know what I'm talking about. So yeah, that's I think where it sets itself apart.
Yeah, I think I agree with you there, Nick, that I think the ultimate purpose of Taxi Driver versus other vigilante films of the 70s is what differs it. And the idea of asking questions and provoking answers rather than showing Charles Bronson fill a sock with pennies and go out and take out the punks because that's the right thing to do. I think that the purpose is a little deeper than that. And I will note, even in his chapter on Taxi Driver, Quentin Tarantino does a lot of simplifying and trimming down of the character of Travis Bickle in order to make his reading a little more palatable. He's very quick to dismiss a lot of things that we are told about Travis as definitely being lies, which they could be. I mean, Travis is shown to potentially be a liar depending upon the situation and kind of rephrase things in the way that it benefits him. But one of the things that Quentin Tarantino mentions as the idea of Travis being a veteran, I think kind of adds definitely adds an element to a reading of this film. And Quentin Tarantino believes that Travis is not actually a veteran. He's just a punk who wants to be a hero, and he got a jacket at the Army surplus store. And he addresses that as a definitive fact, which I guess is an interesting reading, but addressing that as no, this is definitely the case, I think simplifies the movie and makes that kind of a reading easier, but I think it also makes it less special in a lot of ways. And I mean, I think this movie is a lot better made than a lot of 70s vigilante movies as well. There's a lot of talent firing on all cylinders here for a project that, on paper, doesn't necessarily feel like it would deserve it. It's strange to me that Bernard Herrmann, his last score is for this gritty little sort of vigilante 70s movie. And it's interesting to see the arc from him from doing big studio lavish Hitchcock pictures to gritty Taxi Driver. I mean, that's also just the leanings of cinema at that point as well. But you have this enormous talented team putting together a movie that deliberately looks like urine in every frame. Yeah. It's just such an interesting contrast, and even more so in the desaturated finale, which, whether or not it was done out of necessity, which it's been claimed it was to get past the MPAA, that look I think really contributes to the ending, and just I think the whole aesthetic of the film has a lot more going for it than Death Wish 3 and all the other films like that kind of came out of the workings, possibly because of it. That kind of takes us through all of my questions, but any other final thoughts on the film before we move on to the rundown?
I would be remiss if I did not mention Martin Scorsese's exquisite director cameo. He actually makes... It's funny, this is something I noticed for the first time here. He actually makes two cameos. The first shot where we see Sybil Shepherd's character, he is sitting there just on the steps.
Yes.
Which is something that I had never seen, and this is now the third time I've seen it. But his actual cameo as sort of the physical manifestation of orderly evil, of a guy who seems to have clearly thought out his plan and knows what he wants to do, sort of presented as this... I think it's interesting that he is in the exact same position as Palantine in the back of Travis's cab, but is so very, very different. You know, it's a thing where I don't know if it was intentional, but it is a thing of like, imagine if this guy was president, you know, like, he seems like a very normal, educated man, but he is absolutely insane. It's the sort of sense that this could be lurking in anybody that I think is very compelling. And yeah, I mean, Scorsese is just electric. He steals that scene somehow from De Niro, which I think is very hard to do in a film like this.
And I should mention that I also stole that scene for a film that I made in my junior year of college. I didn't realize quite how flagrantly I stole that scene until I rewatched it this time. And I mean, it's like right down to some of the lighting and shots, and I was like, oh, how embarrassing. I committed the ultimate film school theft and
you know, of all the
Driver.
scenes to crib, that's a good one.
Yeah, I don't know if now's an appropriate time to offer a half-hearted defensive Joker. I don't think it is, but I'll just say that rip-offs are inevitable, and if you're ripping off a really good thing and doing at least something somewhat different with it, I tend to be pretty generous to that. Like if La La Land is just a shameless rip-off of Jacques Demy, great. Bring on more of those, because it's still much more interesting than 95% of Hollywood this century. So, you know, I don't know.
If that's what you think that Joker is doing, then that is true.
Yeah.
That's what I will say to that.
Yeah.
If that's what you think is going on
I
with
think
Joker.
the difference is I'm like mostly okay with it. But, you know.
Yeah.
And I watched the King of Comedy for the first time recently, and I was like, okay, yeah. I still think, whatever. That's another...
If you're going to steal from the greats.
I will second that. Yeah, what were you going to say, Christian? Sorry.
Yeah, sorry, I'm dragging on here. What else was I going to say? I like that
Scorsese speed up.
Rips off himself in Wolf of Wall Street, because there's that exchange between Bickle and Sybil Shepherd's character. And he's like, we're going to be friends. And she's like, we're going to be friends. And then in Wolf of Wall Street, there's like a very similar exchange between DiCaprio and Margot Robbie. And the difference being Margot Robbie cuts right through the crap and just looks at him and says, we're not going to be friends. But that intense exchange and that turn of phrase is just so electric.
Yeah. I think Joker is his own person. I think that I'm glad that I was expecting a lot more to be ripped off, but like thinking about it and like comparing it in my head, I was thinking this is probably like the most acceptable like ripping off. You know, this is not like McDonald's, but you like change the M to be like Comic Sans or something. This is like heavily inspired that it's basically the same story and character progression, but with a different character in different circumstances. So I think that's pretty much what it is.
Okay.
No comment.
Since this has turned into the Joker hour, I'll also throw my hat in the ring here. I don't particularly like Joker, sort of because I think I saw The King of Comedy and Taxi Driver before I'd seen Joker, so I went in and went, oh, okay, I've seen this, except the Joker is on it now, which I suppose is fun if you're a big DC fan. And I think it's neat potentially to take inspiration from something very outside the grain to make your comic book movie. But I think that kind of leaves the only substance standing being that character. And I'm kind of sick of that character, so it didn't really do that much for me. I don't know. I think I'm not offended by Joker because it's a ripoff as much as I am kind of saddened by it, because I know there's a lot of people who are going to watch Joker and go, "Whoa, it's so deep, man," and they're not going to. I don't know. It's like having a teacup when you could have access to a whole pool that's right there like 40 years ago, but it's on Netflix and you could watch it and it's right there. But a lot of people probably aren't going to because they've already seen it. They saw Joker. And that, I think, is what kind of angers me about the movie more than anything else. Yeah. In relation to Taxi Driver, though, I think we've already mentioned a lot of the broader strokes. I just wanted to point out a specific thing. I love the way that Travis's taxi is filmed in Taxi Driver. Yeah. Specifically, there's that opening kind of shot where it comes out through the mist, and there's later scenes where you get specific shots of the mirror, the grill, the bonnet, and it makes the taxi, at least to me, feel huge. It feels like this rolling war machine just kind of strolling through the streets of New York. I think it was Paul Schrader who said that he wanted it to feel like a roving coffin that Travis was stuck inside, and it does kind of have that ominous feel to it. And anytime that Travis is rolling around in the taxi, it feels like a hearse driving past, this enormous thing that kind of casts a threat everywhere around it. And I really appreciate that. Even though I don't think it comes back that much after the first half of the film, it really makes an impression when it first shows up.
There's just a way that those old cars move that feels so detached and ambivalent. Mm-hmm. It moves like this sort of grandiose, like a battleship or like a tank or something like that. And it seems to just sort of be omnisciently judging the tableau of filth that surrounds it in this 1970s New York, which is so exquisitely photographed and is such an interesting cultural artifact, I think. Fran Lebowitz talks a lot about the texture of New York changing a lot in the last 50 years. Mm-hmm. I think Taxi Driver is a very interesting example of how different the city used to look and feel. I think it's one of the clearest and best opportunities that we have now to sort of imagine what it was like back then, which I think is one of my favorite aspects of it. I saw this film when I was like 14 maybe for the first time on like Netflix, and you had always heard stuff about cities in the 70s being terrible, being full of crime and prostitution and all this stuff. But this was the first time that I had ever seen a city in the 70s portrayed so honestly. And I remember telling my mom after I saw it, I was like, I didn't know it sucked that bad. And that is what really has stuck with me about Taxi Driver since I saw it for almost a decade now.
Now the crime's worse. It's just underground.
Yeah, I don't think that stuff impacted me quite as much when I saw Taxi Driver for the first time, because I had seen a lot of the B-roll from Frank Henenlotter's Basket Case, which does a very similar thing where they just kind of like rode around in a cab and he poked the camera out the window when they were on like 42nd Street. And it really gives you a feel of like, wow, this is a very, very different place. And
it's almost alien, yeah.
Kind of a marvel that they cleaned it up at all in the past 40 years, just because it feels like a totally different country almost. Okay, well, I think then that wraps up our discussion on Taxi Driver, and we can move along to our classic segment. We've been doing it since season 1, the rundown.
I remember.
Yeah. Pumped.
For any new viewers, this episode,
keep running.
Christian is the target of the rundown. This season.
Get out of my cab.
And Nick, Mitchell, and I.
Robert.
have a list of terms and little vocab things from the film Taxi Driver. We're going to list them off at Christian one by one, and he has to give a rating out of 5 as quick as he can to try to get through the whole list in a minute. Mitchell, what order should we go in for this?
We'll go Zach, Nick, and Mitchell. We'll go third.
All right.
Okay. Alrighty, well, we're going to start in 3, 2, 1. Gotta open up my chat here. Sultry jazz music.
3 out of 5.
Cleaning the back seat.
4 out of 5.
Becoming a person like other people.
4 out of 5.
A clean
City
driving
lights.
record.
Ooh, City Lights 4, Clean Driving Record 4.
Political knowledge.
4 out of 5.
Juji fruits.
5 out of 5.
Getting organized.
4 out of 5.
A dirty movie.
4 out of 5.
Chris Christophson's The Silver Tongue Devil and I.
3 out of 5.
Munitions minute.
4 out of 5.
A crumpled $20 bill.
4 out of 5.
To a Good Couple of Scouts.
3 out of 5.
You talking to me?
3 out of 5.
Being square.
4 out of 5.
Jam and sugar on toast. Oh, that is the minutes.
Don't answer.
We'll never know
Tis
what
the
Christian
nature.
thinks of jam and sugar on toast.
Tis
I was
the nature
so happy we got to you talking to me. I was like, that's so late now that we might miss it.
I was worried we weren't going to get to that one either. Yeah. Alrighty. Well, I think we're wrapping up the episode here. Nick, thank you for coming back on the show. Is there anything you'd like
Thank
to plug before we end?
Man, it's always a pleasure, guys. Don't have anything new to plug, but I think I want to plug Taxi Driver. If you haven't seen it in a while, even if you watched it yesterday, put it in next time you can. Watch it. It's amazing.
Excellent. Alrighty. Next time, Christian, you'll be hosting our episode. So what are we going to be talking about next episode?
Right. Right. It's one of two. We've been recording so much out of order. I know that it's one of these two films, but I'm blanking on which one I'm supposed
It's
to
the
say.
future-most one that you can think. This is episode 95.
Okay, so international shortage of pink paint. Am I on the right track here?
Yes, you are.
Okay. So, grab your plastic. Open up those drawers in your childhood bedrooms, stuffed with action figures or dolls or what have you, and pull out that graphic T-shirt of that you used to wear in the second grade, because we're going to discuss Greta Gerwig's Barbie, which is going to be something. I'm sure. I'm quite excited. I've seen more than I wanted to through the trailers, but what I have seen has me optimistic. As with a script co-written by Noah Baumbach and deliciously goofy takes from Ryan Gosling as Ken. I think we're in for something memorable, one way or the other. And hopefully this will appeal to the kiddos out there that are clamoring to see Margot Robbie wear pink dresses. So if that interests you, come join us.
Yes.
And if you're anybody else, go see Oppenheimer with me.
Or if you are a man of the people, you can come with me, where we will be watching what I like to call a Barbenheimer sandwich. So this is Oppenheimer sandwich. It's the meat is Oppenheimer. And we have Barbie bread, so that's Oppenheimer, Barbie, in that order. Sort of a ramp up, then we get like sort of a 3-hour big meaty sandwich, and then we get a nice light cool down. So
That's kind of great.
Wow.
yeah,
That's a long day at the movies.
it's a long day at the movies. Well, Saturday in July. What else am I going to be doing?
Yeah. And I will point out to our audience, despite the fact that this episode is coming out in August, we're recording this shortly before Barbie is going to be released in cinemas. So have no fear, when we record our discussion on Barbie, we will have quite recently seen it. You're not getting secondhand memories from this podcast.
Yeah.
No, sir.
So tune
It
in
was
next
so
time
bad.
if you'd like to hear our discussion on Greta Gerwig's Barbie. Until then, good night and good luck, folks.
Ta-ta.
Bye.